The Frost interviews were always the ones where Alastair would often say to me afterwards, "What did you say?" And I would say, "What did I say?" I mean, many times I used to go on David Frost programs and I'd come out of it and think, how did I give them all those stories? I didn't really mean to do that, but you would have done it. But one occasion when I went on and actually got the story I intended to have was when I decided we wanted to do a huge NHS reform. I'd been in power 2-3 years. The NHS was really a breaking point. We decided to do big reform, and that had to be accompanied by big investment. And essentially, I pledged that we would bring British health spending up to the EU average. And I announced it on the programme. Gordon was a little dismayed, but in the end, frankly, went along and provided the money, so that was good. But that was a good way of doing it. That those programs were places in those days where you made a big announcement in order to make the necessary, impact.
I suppose it's that thing, isn't it, that you do on a Sunday morning, you then sort of dominate the Monday's papers, and then that sort of sets the tone for the whole week. Other people I've spoken to have talked about having, when you're planning a week of announcements, what you did on the Sunday shows was a sort of key part of launching that.
Yes, in terms of communication strategy, Sunday programs were important. I mean, I think they still are important to a degree, at least, because it can shape the news not just for that day and the Monday, but also for the week. It can help if you're the Prime Minister. It can help shape what Prime Minister's questions is likely to be about on the Wednesday. So it's got a lot of. If you've got something clear you want to say, and you want it to form the major talking point for the week, a Sunday program still, I think, a pretty good place to do it.
And what are the risks of doing it? Because obviously, not only the Westminster Village watch them, but normal people watch them as well. And the risk of going on and making a mistake. Can you remember that happening to you?
Well, I can remember often going on and not really wanting the story to be what the story ended up being. I think the most important thing with any interview is to be clear in your own mind. What is it you really want to say? And what happens with a lot of politicians is they go on and they're not really clear what they want to say. They haven't thought it through. And I used to say to people, when you're doing these interviews, even if the interview is 5 minutes long, think of every angle. Think of all the hard questions. Think of the questions that you've got a queasy feeling you don't really know the answer to, and then find the answer to it, or find at least a way of avoiding an answer. But it's you get better about it over time. But the hardest thing is when someone puts a question to you that you don't quite anticipate, and then you either look as if you're being kind of weaselly and avoiding it, or you can blunder into some pretty big traps.
And because there have been so many over the years, but David Frost, Andrew Marr, Andrew Neil, Jeremy Vine, John Sopel, Robert Peston, Sophie Ridge these days as too. Who did you? Well, exactly. Who did you like being interviewed by, and who did you dread?
So for me, I never particularly liked or dreaded. I mean, the more combative people, your sort of John Humphreys, Jeremy Paxmans, I mean, you were always aware of the fact it was, you were going to go in and have 10 rounds and, come out fairly battered. But, in the end, you just had to make up your mind that was what was going to happen, and there it is. But for me, some interviewers were obviously easier to deal with because they weren't so antagonistic. But all interviews are tricky because, you're dealing with often politically sensitive subjects. And, one of the reasons why people think politicians are often evasive is because sometimes you're not prepared at that moment to be fulsome in what you set out you're going to do. And sometimes, frankly, there are sensitivities around saying what you think that may mean you don't want to say it, but it's not necessarily because you're being evasive. There can be other reasons. There may be public reasons or private reasons why, or party reasons why you don't want to do it. But I never, for me, there weren't interviewers I feared or liked particularly, because those two styles, one combative, one more conversational, both are always difficult. Now, I personally think in the end, the public, it likes to see the politicians get grilled, but there are ways of grilling without being sort of rude or interrupting them every 10 seconds. But in the end, it's much more important, if you're the interviewee, to be in that position where you're clear about what you think. That is, and it doesn't matter whether the interview is nice or nasty in those terms. It's still important to know what you really want to say or don't.
I mentioned David Frost, and obviously he sort of famously had these breakfasts after the show. You went to some of the, and is it right? You ended up playing You went back to his house and played football. Wilfred Frost remembers you playing football in his garden.
Yeah. No, I remember after one interview, we went back and played football in David's garden down in his house in the country. And I mean, David was immensely charming, and he would often phone you up after an interview just to say thank you for coming on. It was such a good interview. He's so pleased to have you. He was a great operator, and even though some of his interviewing style was you might describe as somewhat laconic and laid back, you would get through a lot of stuff. You would always get through a lot of stuff, and very often you would end up with 4 or 5 stories. So as I say, you didn't ever think you were going to go in and he was going to be rude to you. But I can't ever think I did an interview with David where he didn't end up getting quite a big story.
And then you walk off the set, and then did you have Alastair Campbell in your ear saying, "Why did you say that? Why?"
Alastair, the Frost interviews were always the ones where Alastair would often say to me afterwards, "What did you say?" And I would say, "What did I say?" And then he was like, "Did I really say that?" Yeah, well, he did. No, but it's. I think also being prepared to submit yourself to tough interviews is an important rite of passage, and it's also an important way, particularly when you've got a very difficult issue. I mean, when I was dealing with really, really difficult issues, some of the reform issues, post 9/11 issues, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, some of those interviews were very tough and, very intellectually, politically, psychologically testing. But I think it's a good idea to do it, because I think it's really important always to explain to people what it is you're trying to do. And one of the things that's most difficult when you leave the political stage, and I've said this to a lot of political leaders, as they're leaving, is you're no longer the first person in front of the microphone. So other people interpret what you've done or what you say. Whereas the one thing you've got when you are in power or in a position in frontline politics is that microphone's available to you. So use it and go and speak to people. And when you've got a complicated, difficult thing you're trying to get across to people, it's better to be put under the cosh.